This is continuing coverage in the trial of Richard Merritt from the Hidden Killers podcast on the True Crime Today network.
Is this photograph a photo of those injuries that I just pointed out?
Yes.
And that you said that they appear to be stab wounds. Is that correct?
Yes.
What do you mean by a stab wound?
A stab wound is a result of what we call a sharp force injury. A sharp object, a knife, for example, it enters the skin, and the definition of a stab wound is that the depth of the knife wound is greater than the length of the surface wound. If the surface wound is superficial, if the knife doesn't penetrate very far, then we call that an incised wound. For example, like running the knife blade over the surface of the skin, but not entering at any great distance.
Looking at State's Exhibit 61, which has previously been admitted into evidence, based on your observations, is it your opinion that those stab wounds in the photograph that's being displayed now are consistent with having been made by the weapon in State's Exhibit 61?
Yes.
Okay. And are they consistent with each other in the sense that do they appear to have been made by the same blade?
Yes.
How so?
The configurations are almost identical, and judging from the length of each wound, the length of each wound is very similar, and it's consistent with the width of the blade.
Are you able to see the photograph on the screen in front of you?
I have so many photographs in front of me, it's hard to keep track.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that
Yes.
you're seeing what you're seeing. Okay. Looking at State's Exhibit 66, where on the body is this wound or injury located?
I believe that's on the torso.
Okay. Do you know which area of the torso?
I think that's on the right.
Okay. And is this wound also consistent with being made by, well, how would you describe this wound?
This is a more complex wound where it appears that they can't see my pointer, can they?
No, but you can stand up.
Oh, thank you.
Or I think that would probably be, well, you know what, I don't know if they can see behind
It
the,
looks like the edge of the knife either entered here but then was turned so that it pivoted on the initial entrance site or the initial axis.
does that indicate to you?
I can say twisted instead of turned. That's what I meant.
Does that indicate movement by one of the parties to you?
Excuse me?
Does that indicate movement to you by one of the parties?
Well, it could be movement by the blade or it could be movement by the decedent.
And would you consider this to be a stab wound as well?
Yes.
I next want to focus on the injuries, specifically the injury that's marked stab wound on the decedent's neck.
Yes.
On State's Exhibit 64, we see two wounds. How would you describe those?
They both appear to be stab wounds.
And based on your observations, are they consistent with having been made by the knife that you can see in State's Exhibit 61 in front of you?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about each of those stab wounds, and I want to talk about the one that's kind of lower down on the left clavicle. Based on your review of this case, do you believe that this injury would have been life-threatening?
It could have been life-threatening, yes.
Okay. Do you believe that it was something that immediately would have incapacitated the decedent?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Now, what about the wound on the right side of the neck that we see above it? Can you describe what we're looking at in that wound, on the neck?
That particular wound entered the soft tissue of the neck, and it cut the external jugular vein.
What does the jugular vein do?
It returns blood from the head to the heart.
Was that a life-threatening injury?
Yes, that could be life-threatening.
Okay. How would a person die from that kind of injury?
They would die from excessive loss of blood. The technical term that we use is hypovolemic shock.
Would that wound have immediately ended the life of Shirley Merritt?
Not immediately.
Okay. How long do you expect Miss Merritt would have lived after receiving that stab wound to the neck?
She could survive on the order of minutes.
I'm sorry, what was that? The order?
The order of minutes.
Minutes, and can you say 10 minutes versus 2 minutes? Do you know?
I would say maybe 2 to 3 minutes or 2 to 5 minutes.
Would it immediately have incapacitated Miss Merritt?
Not immediately.
Would Miss Merritt have been able to move during those minutes after receiving that injury to the neck?
Yes.
Would she have been able to speak or make any vocal sounds?
She should have been able to speak or make vocal sounds.
I want to discuss some of the other injuries that we see on this anatomy chart. First of all, it's labeled stab wound to the face. Is that an injury that you would, and I'll show you State's Exhibit 59 for your review. Do you see that stab wound that's labeled as stab wound to the face here in that photograph?
Yes.
Would you consider that injury to be immediately life-threatening?
Not necessarily.
Would that be an injury that would immediately incapacitate Ms. Merritt?
It could incapacitate her, yes.
But would it have done so immediately?
No, not necessarily.
And finally, I want to focus on what is marked here. It appears to be the right side of the head.
The right side of the head?
Yes.
Okay, I understand, yes.
If you see that?
Yes.
If we're looking from the back, it's the right
Yes.
side of the head. Would you please look at State's Exhibit 62? What does that exhibit show?
What that exhibit shows is a gaping laceration on the side of the head. Laceration meaning a tear in the tissue that looks like a combination of both what we call blunt impact injury, but with an object that has an edge capable of tearing the skin surface and opening it up as a laceration.
Just a moment.
Also, in the center of that picture is elliptical opening that's consistent with the blade of a knife, the tip of a knife, reaching that depth, most likely from the facial stab wound on that side.
Would that injury to the right side of the head, would that have been immediately life-threatening?
Yes.
Would it have caused would it immediately have incapacitated Mrs. Merritt?
Yes.
Okay. And is that consistent with being caused by a heavy object?
Yes.
In your opinion, what was the cause of death of Mrs. Merritt?
The cause of death was a combination of blunt impact injury and stab wounds.
Okay. And how did the blunt impact injury to the head cause death?
The blunt impact injury seen in that picture actually fractured the underlying skull. It also produced a fracture of the part of the skull that is underneath the brain. We call that the basilar portion of the skull, and we call that a basilar skull fracture. It caused hemorrhages over the surface of the brain that we call subarachnoid hemorrhages, and it also caused hemorrhages within the brain, which we call contusions or bruises within the brain. The combination of those types of injuries would have produced irreversible brain damage. I say that not only as a forensic pathologist, but I'm also a neuropathologist.
Dr. Weiner, would that injury to the right side of the head have been consistent with being caused by a 35-pound dumbbell as we see in States Exhibit 32?
Yes.
When we watch movies or shows like CSI sometimes, you hear a medical examiner or an investigator who finds a body and is able to put a time of death on that body. Is that something that happens in real life?
Not really.
Okay. What are some of the factors that you need to consider when determining whether you are able to determine a time of death?
We usually start with the time when the decedent is pronounced. We look at the presence of several factors. One is rigor, which means that the muscles begin to contract a short time after death, whether there's rigor present or whether it is past. And also another observation in terms of that we call lividity, which is the pooling of blood where the body has been laying. Usually the pooling occurs in a dependent position. So if the body's laying on the back, the blood will pool on the back. If we apply pressure to this area of lividity, if it blanches, it becomes pale, it hasn't been fixed. So that means that the death interval, has been relatively short. If it doesn't blanch, we say that the lividity is fixed, and that indicates that the body has been deceased somewhat longer. There are a number of environmental factors that we have to consider. So considering the time of death is not a precise science.
You did discuss rigor. When does rigor generally set in? Can you approximate that after the death?
It'll usually begin to set in within maybe 30 minutes to an hour.
And how long does rigor last?
Again, depending on environmental circumstances, rigor can last for up to 48, even in some cases 72 hours.
When a body is collected by the medical examiner's office, is it refrigerated somehow?
Yes.
And how does that affect rigor?
That can, in some ways, it can enhance rigor.
All right.
But not always.
All right. And do you know whether Shirley Merritt was in that state of rigor at the time that she was examined by Dr. Cunningham?
Yes, it's stated in the report.
Okay. And are you able to put any kind of precise timing on her death?
No, I can't put a precise timing.
Can you estimate?
One could estimate, based on when she was last seen alive.
Okay. Based on your review of this case, would it be possible or would it be consistent with your findings that Miss Merritt died sometime during the day of February 1st of 2019?
Yes, that would be consistent with the findings at autopsy.
I have no further questions.
Good morning, doctor.
Good morning.
You are not the medical examiner who examined the body of Miss Merritt, correct?
Correct.
You never came in contact with the deceased in this case?
No, I did not.
You did not go to 1590 Planters Row?
No,
And you didn't visit the scene of this case?
I did not.
Your involvement did not begin until recently, correct?
Correct.
And that was when?
I believe it was last week.
Now, the state just asked you about time of death, and you indicated that that is a difficult thing to give, correct?
In some instances, yes.
And there was no actual time of death given in this case, right?
Correct.
And in reviewing the reports and the photographs, you cannot say whether it was just one single stab wound or one of the blunt force injuries that caused this death.
Could you rephrase the question?
Sure. The determination in this case was that it was a combination of wounds that caused the death. Is that right?
Yes.
In other words, it was not just one single injury.
Yes.
And you cannot say in this case the number of assailants involved in the death.
No, I cannot.
Nothing further. Thank you, doctor.
Dr. Weiner, may I continue, Your Honor? Yes. Dr. Weiner, would the injury to Miss Merritt's neck that we see in State's Exhibit 64. State's Exhibit 64, would this injury alone have caused Mrs. Merritt to die?
Potentially, yes.
And what about the injury to the right side of her head, which you described as a blunt impact injury? Would that have alone caused Mrs. Merritt to die?
Yes.
Okay. And I just had one other thing. There, if you look at Exhibit 58 and 58A, there appears to be on the front of Miss Merritt's face some kind of bruise or contusion, and you can see it in the photographs.
Yes.
Can you give a description to the jury of what you believe that injury kind of around Mrs. Merritt's eye to be?
There's an abrasion present, and it's on a bruised base. We will frequently describe an injury like that as a abrasion over a contusion.
Okay. And what would that have been caused by?
Blunt impact trauma.
And are each of the incised and stab wounds that you have reviewed in the photographs, do they appear, is it consistent that they would have all been caused by the same weapon?
Yes.
And would the weapon, as you see in State's Exhibit 61, is that consistent with potentially having caused each of those injuries?
Yes, it is.
Okay. No further questions.
Anything further, this witness?
Not from the State, Your Honor.
May the witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Weiner.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, next witness.
The State calls Investigator Amber Winslow.
Amber Winslow, AMBER WINSLOW.
Good morning, Investigator Winslow. How are you employed?
I am Deputy Chief Investigator at the DeKalb County Medical Examiner's Office.
How long have you been employed with the ME's office?
6 years.
All right. And what does an investigator with the ME's office do?
We document and investigate all reported deaths to our office, deaths that occur in DeKalb County.
Do you go to the scene where a death has occurred?
Depending on the type of death, yes.
Okay. When there is a suspected homicide, do you respond to those scenes?
We do if the decedent is still on scene, yes.
Okay. Do you recall responding to Planter's Way in Stone Mountain on February 1st of 2019?
believe on February 2nd, I did respond.
I apologize, February 2nd. What was the call in regard to?
It was in regards to a homicide.
Okay. Was the decedent still on the scene at that time?
Yes.
Do you recall what time you responded to that scene?
I responded at 2:15.
It was at 2:15 a.m. or p.m.?
p.m. I'm sorry.
All right. And what did you find when you responded?
Well, our response, we come, after the police were the last ones to arrive. So I meet with detectives, get whatever information I need. I photograph the scene, immediate scene, and the body that is on scene. So on this particular day, I did all of that. And I was escorted into the scene, and that's where Miss Merritt, to her body. And she was at the bottom of the stairs, the basement.
All right. And can you just give a general description of her body when you responded to the scene?
Yes. She was at the bottom of the stairs, lying on her left side, kind of in a curled up position. She was fully clothed. I say that that's something we document, Upon further investigation, we have to document any injury, trauma, anything like that, and photograph it as well.
And did you turn her over at any time?
Yes, absolutely. So we photograph and document what we see initially, and then I did flip her over to see if there were any other injury or trauma to her, to the other side of her body.
Did you see any injuries when you turned her over that you did not see initially when you responded?
I did.
Can you describe that for the jury?
Yes. When I flipped her over, I did observe what appeared to be sharp force injuries to her neck area, and also trauma to her face, and also I observed a very large knife blade sticking out of her cheek, her right cheek.
Did you see any items around Mrs. Merritt's body that you recall?
Yes. Crime scene for the police department had already been there, so they had items marked. I did observe one of the pieces of evidence marked was a black knife, a handle to a knife, and also a weight, a 35-pound weight was also marked.
Investigator Winslow, can I get you to move a little closer or speak up just a little bit?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank
Sorry.
you.
Do you have experience with determining whether a body is in rigor mortis?
I do have some experience, yes.
And could you tell, just based on your observation, whether Mrs. Merritt's body was in rigor at that time?
Once I did manipulate her body and roll her over, I did observe her to be in rigor, yes.
And what information are you basing that on?
Her muscles were stiff, so when I rolled her, her body stayed in that position with her knees bent. Her arms remained in the position they were when she was initially found. So when I rolled her up, her muscles in her hands and arms were stiff and staying in that position. They didn't just fall limp once I moved her.
Did you notice anything in Mrs. Merritt's hands?
I did.
What
I did
was that?
observe she had hair. It appeared to be possibly her own hair.
I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 67. Is this a photograph of one of Mrs. Merritt's hands?
It is. It is.
And what are we looking at here in State's Exhibit 68?
Right. That's her right hand, and that has hair in it. It appears to be the way she was found. Her hand was up near her face and head, so it appears to me that was her hair. So.
Did you bag her hands?
Absolutely. On every homicide, we bag their hands, whether we see any type of evidence or not. Just something we do in case there's trace evidence that we can't see, but we do that to protect any evidence so then it can be recovered back at the lab during the autopsy.
And that evidence that you were protecting, would that have been the hair in Mrs. Merritt's hand?
Correct.
I'm going to show you, well, I'll show you what I've marked as State's Exhibit 60. Would you please look at that item and explain what it is to the jury?
Okay. This is an, may I allowed to open it?
Yes.
Okay. An evidence box that came from our lab. This is the blade to, this is the knife blade that was found sticking out of her face. This blade, I don't remove anything from scenes, so I photographed it, left it in place for the doctor to see. Prepared her for transport by placing her in a body bag with that still in her face, and sealed the bag with a tag and a zip tie. From there, she was transported from the scene to the lab, where they would have removed that during autopsy.
Would you, how were you able to identify this as the actual blade that was removed from Mrs. Merritt's face?
It was mainly because this is our evidence box, this is our label that has our case number, the victim's information, and anyone from our office that is involved in the case, the doctor's name, the lab tech, and my name as the investigator.
And what is the case number that's labeled with?
19-0188.
This time I move to State's Exhibit 60.
Any objection? Admitted.
Did you photograph that item as well?
I did.
Looking at State's Exhibit 61. Was that blade longer than 3 inches in length?
Yes, it appears to be. I did not measure it personally because, again, at scene, we don't manipulate anything like that. But yes.
Was it consistent with being a kitchen knife?
It appears so. It appeared to be, yes.
Thank you, investigator.
Good morning, Investigator Winslow. When you arrived at the scene, I believe you said it was 2:18 p.m., you met with the officers that were already there, is that right?
Yes, you're about 2:15.
And they...
I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I think it was 2:15, my response time.
And they inform you about the scene that you're going to go into, is that right?
Right. They give me any additional information and their investigation that's ongoing at the time, but yes.
And at that time, they informed you about the suspect, Richard Merritt, is that right?
Yes.
And that was the only person that they informed you about as a suspect at that time,
At
right?
that time, that is correct.
Thank you. Nothing further, thank you.
Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
May the witness be excused.
Yes.
Ms. Wolf-Gruber?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Investigator Winslow. Call your next witness.
Your Honor, at this time the state rests.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you all to please step into the jury room for a moment. Are there any motions for the court to consider?
Not from the state.
Your Honor, this time we will move for the verdict of acquittal. The state has done an admirable job of proving that Mrs. Merritt was the victim of a homicide. However, we believe that they have fallen short of proving that Richard Merritt is the perpetrator in this case. So we therefore move for acquittal as to all counts.
Ms. Pye?
Your Honor, I believe that we have identified the defendant as the perpetrator. He was at the house between 9:38 a.m. and 2:30 that day. After he left, there were no signs of forced entry, no signs of any tampering or any theft other than the vehicle and the phone that he had stolen from his mother. The victim was cooking a meal for the defendant before he was supposed to turn himself into jail. And as she explained to her husband's cousin, Mike Jeffco, things were bad that day. He absconded from the scene, and Your Honor, the only reasonable theory of what happened during that day was that the defendant committed this offense. Yes, and additionally, Your Honor, the victim, Mrs. Merritt, was killed by items from inside the home.
All right, the court does find that there is sufficient evidence that has been submitted for this case to go forward to the jury, and I find that as to all 6 counts in the indictment, so I will deny the defendant's motion. Mr. Queen, has your client made a decision about whether or not he's going to testify?
Your Honor, can I speak to Mr. Merritt briefly on that matter?
Yes.
On that?
Yes. Be in recess for about 10 minutes. Deputy Madison, once you've taken him in the back, will you let the jury know we're going to take a short break and then we'll come back for testimony before lunch?
You're listening to the trial of Richard Merritt from the Hidden Killers podcast on the True Crime Today network. Press subscribe now and get ad-free episodes by upgrading to our premium experience through Apple Podcasts. More next.